Thank you to Ed and to Libby for taking this on at the last moment, literally just days ago. So we really appreciate them saying that they would come with absolutely no notice. So here's Libby to introduce the speech for today.
Turn it when you're done eating.
Hey, thank you, Catherine. I'm okay.
Yes.
Unmute.
I am muted.
No, you're looking good, Lib. Okay. I don't know how.
You're muted. You had it backwards. Still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I hear you.
Yep.
Yeah. Finally, okay. This afternoon, Ed is going to talk to you, excuse me, about Edith Wharton's adventures as she wandered through the front in France in 1915. In case you're interested, we had several books. Ed did a Edith Wharton and Mary Roberts Reinhardt on the Western Front, which is a very interesting book, mainly because I like Mary Roberts Reinhardt and he likes Edith Wharton. So that was one thing that we wrote. Then we did a fiction book, but it has historical photographs in it. Mm-hmm. And that one is called Edith Wharton and the Verdun Caper. So that's a fiction, but with historical photos. And then within the last 2 years, Ed, got involved with this magazine. Can you see this, World War I Illustrated? And if you're interested in articles about the First World War, this is a great magazine. Okay, without further ado, I'll bring Ed up to talk. Excuse me, are you ready?
I guess so.
Okay, here we go.
So what do I do now here?
All right, now.
Hello in TV land. Just press screen share. Okay, got it. All right, I pressed it. Now what do we do now? Yeah.
Did it bring up your own screen?
Okay, click on your PowerPoint and click share. Click on this one here.
This one?
Yeah, and then share.
Share.
Blue button over there.
Blue. Oh,
No, sorry. There you go. Now you're good.
now we're all set. All right, can anybody hear me? We all set? All right. Well, we're going to talk about Edith Wharton's 1915 tours of the Western Front. Not all of the tours, because she took many. Just to cover a couple of places she visited, because she traveled essentially throughout the whole Western Front. And this is based upon her, she traveled on the Western Front in 1915 in spring and summer. She traveled, she wrote up her experiences in a series of magazine articles or published in Scribner's and the Saturday Evening Post, then later pulled together into a book, Fighting France, which was published in 15. The 1917 issue, which I have, had a typo, which must have vexed her to no end, because it wasn't Belport, it was Belfort. So things like that happen even to the famous. Here are the travelers. Edith, of course, here. And this is her fellow traveler, the man she always traveled with, and these would be Walter Berry. Walter Berry, but many biographers believe he was, well, they were very close friends and possibly even intimate friends, but they always traveled together. And so what we're looking at is our travels between those two, and then a lot of people that sort of hang on and add to the journey. They traveled high class. They traveled in a Mercedes Landaulet. This is a pre-war Mercedes Landaulet from the Mercedes Museum. This is the kind of car, and she didn't travel, on the rough. She basically travels in this Mercedes limousine, a Landaulet, and you can know that's a Landaulet because it has this back part folds down, so it's kind of a half convertible. And her limousine was chauffeured by her chauffeur, Charles Cook from Massachusetts. So she travels first class. Let's look at where she travels. She starts from Paris, and one of the first trips she makes is to Verdun. Here, this is a German map, so it shows you the Western Front as it existed in 1915. You see the two lines, the German line and the French line. So it's a German map, very detailed. So what she does, she travels to Verdun, but she stops at a little place called Clermont and Argonne. And that's where the adventure begins. Clermont and Argonne is at the edge of the Argonne forest, small village. Libby and I have been there many times. If you'd have been there in 1915, this is what it would have looked like. Because what happened is that in 1914, the German army came through. The German army was led by Crown Prince Wilhelm, the son of Kaiser Wilhelm. So his army came through, and for reasons that are really unclear, they went on a rampage in this little village and really just reduced it to rubble. So this happens in early September 1914. So she gets there in 15, not much changes. So this is an aerial view of the same village. You can see all the remains of houses in the middle, just nothing but standing walls. What's interesting, 2 points to note. The first is that the church would have been on top of a hill here, the ruins of the church, you'll see it in a minute. And the other thing is this building that's intact. The building that's intact here at the bottom has an interesting history. I always lose the arrow. Has an interesting history, as this was where Bismarck had his headquarters in 1870. Because it turns out Clermont has a dubious distinction of having had 2 German invasions. The first one in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, and the second one in 1914. The Franco-Prussian War one was pretty benign, and the headquarters was this building here. And that's the only building that survived the 1914 intrusion. Here's the building today. You can see it's the only building really left from that period. This stairwell leads up to the church. There's the church. Mrs. Wharton visits this church, but when she visits this church, it doesn't look like this. This is a pre-war picture of this church, and this is the way it looked then. It had been totally burned out, decapitated, literally, the whole roof gone, and it had been shelled and destroyed. And the inside, you can see just rubble. She describes going to this church, visiting it, seeing what the damage done by the Huns. And those of you who know Mrs. Wharton's writings, she's very much a Francophile. She really hates the Teutons. And this is the church today. And the inside of the church, still pretty much restored. Now, as we got into this, we were looking for buildings associated with her visit that she mentions. And one of the buildings she mentions is a hospice that she visited, had at lunch with her and Walter Berry, and she visited with a nun. Edith is always very much attracted to sisters and nuns, though she's not Catholic. So the first job was to find out where was this building that she described, where she visited with the nun and carried on. Now this was easier said than done, because what happens is that, well, here's the story of Sister Gabrielle first. So this is the Sister Gabrielle, which was in charge of that building. The hospice was a hospice. And in being in charge of it, what she was noted for, you can see the medals on her breast there, she stopped the Germans from destroying her hospice. What she did was essentially say no to the invaders and prevented them from destroying her hospice. For that, she was, quite renowned, despite the fact that her hospice was sheltering French wounded at the time. So she stopped them just through force of will. In fact, when Claremont was burning, she convinced the commander to use the German pioneers as fire troops, as firemen, to stop the fires from reaching the hospice. So where was this hospice? So now it becomes difficult how to find something that existed 100 years ago in a village that was totally destroyed, and one building left. What building was it? Now it's crowded with other buildings. Well, we went to the Visitors Bureau, a very small little office in Claremont, and tried to communicate to the young gal behind the counter in French that, well, we wouldn't even call it French, something. And she tried to communicate back to us in something we wouldn't call English. And we were both trying to find out where a building might have been in the town that was there 100 years before, you can imagine. Now, this young gal was really pretty bright. She took her computer, got onto Google Translate, and we used Google Translate to go back and forth between English and French and English, and managed to communicate with her. I thought it was really brilliant, actually. So back and forth, back and forth. And she said, well, what we had to do is we had to find the local historian. He could tell us. So she would call him. His name is Hubert Philippe. And he said, come to the house. The people are very friendly. So this is Hubert Philippe. And he led us around. He showed us all these places, both in Claremont and later on in Verdun, that relate to Mrs. Wharton's visit. It turns out he had a passion for her writing and following her adventures in that part of France. This is the building. You can see how it's embedded in all the modern Claremont, so it's hard to find. This is the building that she entertained Edith Wharton in. And this village in the back is where Monsieur Philippe lives. That's where we found him. There's the building today. Now, the next trip she does, she leaves Claremont and keeps heading toward the Western Front. And where she's heading for is Verdun, all right, famous Verdun. Well, she's reaching Verdun in 1915. She's not coming in 1916 when the Battle of Verdun takes place. So this is pre-Battle of Verdun. In those days, in 1915, Verdun was a military town, but it was basically nothing ever happened. It was a very quiet part of the sector. In fact, you can see, even look at a Singer sewing machine had a store. So this is Verdun. Note the two church towers for the cathedral. Verdun actually was a military city. It was a Vauban fortress from the 1600s. You can see the bastions here, and they go all the way around. So what happens is that she's entering a military city of Verdun, but it's a military city in which nothing has happened since 1870. This is the gateway she enters. This is the gate through the city walls that would be facing Claremont. This is where she comes in. Now, you'll note some things about this gate because it changes. Here's the city wall. There's a city wall. These are probably earthen walls. And here's the gate. And under here was a water-filled moat. Okay, so you can imagine that Mercedes limousine coming in through one of these gate halls, entering into the city of Verdun. All right. This is the way it looks today. Turns out things have changed in Verdun, and you'll see why in a minute, but the walls are gone, and were used to fill the moat, which now is public parking. All right. So maybe there's a clue here for Amherst, find a moat to fill and you put public parking in it. Anyway, so this is the gate itself. This is all that's left. So you go through this gate, and then you try to figure out, where did she stay in Verdun? Well, anybody who's ever read Edith's writings about the war, notice she really omits a lot. She really omits where she's going. It's mostly almost a stream of consciousness. And she didn't seem to take notes, or at least if she kept a diary, it is not extant. So very often it's a puzzle figuring it out. And in this case, she wrote a letter to Henry James on hotel stationery. and the hotel stationery was the Hotel Cocardi. And so you track down, she must have stayed at the Cocardi because there's a number of letters where she's using the stationery from Cocardi. And so this is just an advertisement for Cocardi about 1915. And Semper Paratus, I guess, means always ready. Okay. This is the way it looked when she saw it. There's the sign for the Cocardi. You see the rooster. A very narrow street. Right. You see the kids wandering around. So this is a pre-war picture of Verdun and showing you the Cocardi as the hotel where she stays. Things change in Verdun. In 1916, the Battle of Verdun takes place. And this battle is a long battle. It goes on from about April almost through September. And the city is bombarded by artillery, not by airplanes, but by artillery. And so this building here, this is one of the parts of the Cocardi. You can see it's hit. This is the annex of the Cocardi. It was across the street from the main building. The rest of it, Verdun starts to get pulverized. This is the Verdun you see. So a lot of old Verdun kind of vanishes in that bombardment. Okay, and this is the American Field Service ambulance. It turns out the American Field Service ambulance, these volunteers from America, they had a really big role in the Battle of Verdun as far as moving wounded. There you are there, but you can see the buildings just decomposing from shell fire. So what's left when you visit Verdun today? What happens is that street that was facing the Cocardi is gone. It was never rebuilt. In other words, the destruction was so great, they just turned it into an open space. There's a lot of spaces like this in Verdun that were not rebuilt, that were just open spaces. This is the Cocardi. This is the hotel she stayed in. There it is, Cocardi. That's the original hotel. All the rest of it's gone. What's interesting is Liv and I, years ago, we first visited that part of France, stayed at the Cocardi a couple of nights, not knowing that it was related to Edith Wharton or all these other famous people that stayed there. For us, it was just a hotel in the city. So there's Cocardi. Now, if you look at it, this is that street that would have been opposite the Cocardi, is the Cocardi is right there. That's the Edith Wharton Hotel. And this street was never rebuilt. It was just turned into an open space, pedestrian zone. Now, the Battle of Verdun takes place out in these hills. Takes place in these hills, and then the German artillery was within range of the city, and that's why it gets so battered up. Now, this looks familiar, at least to Libby. This is one of our favorite cafes in Verdun, kind of sort of like the Versailles Hall of Mirrors, had a lot of mirrors, but this is really a great place to stop for a coffee and cake and whatever. All right. So what happens is that Edith makes this journey. This is 2 days to get to Verdun, 2 days traveling. So she's here and you see the way the lines go around Verdun. That's the reason it could be shelled almost from all sides. This line is 15, so 16, it gets closer. She attempts to drive to go to Nancy, which is here. So that's the mission, is to go from Verdun to see Nancy. But unfortunately, the fighting in this part of the front really takes off when she's there. And so this trip is essentially blocked by French military. She had to go home. It's getting too dangerous. So then the trip then goes back to Verdun, okay? I mean, back to Paris. All right, so that's the first trip. Turns out she makes 2 or 3 trips to Verdun. She does trips all through the Western Front. She's making these travels. I'll just talk about one more trip she makes. She makes a trip from Verdun, from Paris to Reims, the cathedral city of Reims. This trip is, again, in that Mercedes Landaulet. This trip is also with Walter Berry. In other words, it's the full group is going. The trip is to a short trip to Brass. Then the intention was to go down to the Alsace, which she does. So let's take a look at Brass and see what she saw there. This is Brass Cathedral. Brass Cathedral had the dubious honor of being shelled for almost 4 years of the First World War. This is one of the first hits. No one really knows why the Germans shelled this city and targeted the cathedral. Cathedral is, 13th century cathedral, beautiful structure. But this was one of the first hits. Picture was taken. Turns out, when the shelling began, when the First World War began at Brass, there was a lot of wooden scaffolding on the building because it was undergoing reconstruction. It's just this is ongoing with these kinds of buildings. And what happens is this wooden scaffolding catches fire. It reaches the roof. It reaches the roof of the church or the cathedral. The roof is made up of these ancient oak beams supporting the roof, sheathed in lead plates. That's the roof. Now, what's inside this, just to go back a step, what's inside the cathedral as the shelling begins, is that the Germans managed to reach and take Reims in the first weeks of the war, and the French pushed them out. So it's occupied for a while by the Germans, then it's back to the French. As the Germans retreated, what they did is they left their wounded behind. The wounded the French took into the cathedral, put them on straw pallets inside the cathedral, thinking that would be the safe place. Right? Well, then when the Germans start shelling the place, the scaffolding catches fire, the roof timbers catch fire, the lead melts, and it starts raining lead down on the wounded. And the French, turns out French clergy carried a German wounded out on their backs during the shelling. At least that's the story it's told. This is the inside after it burned. So essentially, the whole nave is just open to the sky. More views of it. The destruction was primarily because of the burning. That's what does it. Just other shots. Now, it turns out the city is then shelled, Reims is shelled throughout the war, from 1914 almost through 1918. The Germans are using this for target practice. It seems to be no tactical significance to this shelling, but it just goes on. And so essentially, all the houses around the church, around the cathedral, start to just break up from the shelling, and that's what you see here. So again, the cathedral is almost standing like a monument, So 2 hands up in the air as the city around it just literally decomposes. You see the roof is gone. What's interesting is that here's a picture of 1917. So in 1917, what we have is that the church structure is really, the medieval masons knew what they were doing. They put something together. You see some damage here. The windows get all blown out. The roof is burned off. And the city all around it just decomposed by shell fire. The experience of Reims becomes a propaganda coup for the French. Because what happens is that this is the evidence that the Hun barbarians are destroying the European cultural heritage. And so you see here is a fellow making a motion picture film, a sign photographer of the actual ruins. Lots of people visited the cathedral. They were taken there. This was sort of the tour that the French took you on to show you how dastardly the Germans were. And in this particular one, this shows you the base of the cathedral covered in sandbags. And the person behind here, this person here, that's Mrs. W.K. Vanderbilt. She was given a tour. And the driver is a duke, a French duke, So she makes a tour to Western Front too. She does it somewhat a little bit later than Mrs. Wharton, but they're seeing the same things. Now, the reason they're giving Vanderbilt the tour is Vanderbilt money was supporting underwriting the American Field Service, those ambulances. So this is what Edith saw. She'd have been right here. This is what you'd see today. Today, it's all rebuilt. You'd never guess the city, anything happened to it. That's the way it looks now. There's a cathedral. Just a close shot. The evidence of the bombing is inside because most of the stained glass windows were blown out. Some they were able to reconstruct, but everybody who visits the church, and probably Edith as well, is when they walk into the nave, they all talk about crunching on medieval glass shards that literally just carpeted the floor. And so a lot of these windows were never replaced. They are replaced in some cases with modern windows. Here's one. These windows are replacements in the 1970s, and they were designed by Marc Chagall, the artist. And that's those are his windows, the Chagall windows. Interestingly, Chagall was a Jewish artist, which talks about the secular nature of this building in the French psyche. And this is Edith. This is the only picture I ever found of her smiling. Every picture you find of Edith, at least that I've ever found, I've looked through a lot of them. She's either not looking at the camera, a la Queen Victoria, who never looked at the camera lens, she made a point not to, or she was just sort of sitting there with no expression on her face, no smile. This is the only picture I found of her. Someone must have told her a joke. Let's say means wounded. This is a carriage, trained truck that would have carried wounded. And this is the picture I started with. Turns out on one of her trips, she had an artist along. So there was always people in this Mercedes going along on these trips. It wasn't just Walter Berry. In this case, she had an artist friend going along, and he drew this sketch of her, this cartoon of her touring. And basically it says, in the ruins, okay, and at the bottom, I won't bother with the French because Libby would just die if I try pronouncing it. It says, this is it? You know, it says, this is all there is? And so it sort of captures Edith. If you look at the picture of Walter, wherever this arrow goes, that's Walter Berry there, and that's pretty close to Walter Berry. This certainly doesn't look like any picture of Edith Wharton. And then this is her chauffeur, Charles Cook, who stayed with her all the time she was in France. All right, so I thought that would be it. We could just end there and then open it up for questions. What do I do? All right. And then we'll see.
Okay, folks, go ahead and raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
Ed, this is Susan. Hi. You see me?
Yes.
Oh, what was was it just an excursion trip she was making, or was there a real purpose to see the front, the soldiers?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Mrs. Wharton was running a lot of charities in Paris, dealing with the refugees coming from the occupied areas of France, and especially dealing with the orphans that were coming out of Belgium. And these trips, she describes them as ways of easing the pressure of just getting away from the responsibilities of running her charities. So basically, you could say they were junkets. And there was a number of them that she takes throughout the Western Front, going pretty much from the North Sea to Switzerland. And she goes and she writes up what she has. The articles go to magazines and then eventually pull together in this book. But you can't say they have any other purpose, really. The first trips were sort of sold as mercy missions. They were bringing things to the soldiers, but as was said, she carried oranges and a few shirts and some eggs, but then she carried Walter and then a couple of other guests and all their luggage. So they were mostly just to get her away from Paris, I think.
Did she ever meet any enemy fire, or was she in danger
No.
at all?
No, she was allowed to go only to quiet sectors of the front. So the one place she does in the Alsace, she does get close to the front lines, and she sees all her writing. She only describes seeing one body, one dead German at a long distance. But
Okay.
that's so she's pretty much taken to parts of the front, or allowed to go to parts of the front that were pretty quiet.
Okay. I did notice in a couple of the photos, she's so elegantly dressed. Like the pleats in one of her outfits are so sharp. She have an iron with her or something. Well, she probably had help with that. But I mean, this is more like a tour. I mean, not tramping through, enemy.
No,
enemy
no,
lines.
she wasn't doing any of that. She was. It was a tour. She stayed in the best hotels.
Yes.
Cocardi was the best hotel. The other places we managed to follow her, they were always in the best hotels.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, just
she
curious.
wasn't set to go into the field, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure she must not have liked that caricature of her standing in the car in the Mercedes.
Well, what's interesting about that caricature is the magazine was published in Paris. There was no name given who it was, and everybody in Paris knew it was her.
Well, they added quite a bit of poundage.
Well, she wasn't that big.
No, she wasn't. Thanks.
But she was, she was nervy to do all this.
Yes,
There's-
absolutely.
You're talking about traveling in 1915 on muddy dirt roads, and it's not
Yeah.
easy. It
No,
wasn't easy.
right. Thank you.
So,
Okay, Dorothy, go ahead.
Well, first I want to say I really appreciated the slides. Really could see them really well here. This is one good thing to say about Zoom, okay? Is
good.
that we really could see your slides and they were well chosen. Though I'm wondering about Edith Wharton. The cartoon is similar to the ones, I guess, Edward Arno. I'm going way back to the 1940s anyway. My parents had a cartoon book of his, and all club women, all women who either talked, wrote, or organized looked like that. That was the caricature. So it was the decentralized, but a woman who was like a managing person, which she was. She had her own power and her own authority.
Mhm.
And that was just something that men did. But was she writing human interest stories, or the war is seen from a woman's eye, or did she interview people, or
She
what was she
mostly,
giving?
anyway, she mostly interviewed higher ranking officers.
Okay,
There's a
interesting.
lot of luncheons, with the staff officers. At least in her writing, you don't get much that she's interacting with, the French soldiers who are in the front lines. She's mostly interacting with officers. She's giving tours of different places. You can't say if you read the book, and it's worth reading, her Fighting France, with those articles all pulled together, you get a great impression of what she experienced. It was difficult for us when we were doing the research on her, was to find out where she experienced it and what else she experienced, because she omits a great deal. I'll just give you one example. In one trip, she goes up to Flanders, and she has an interview with the Queen of the Belgians, Elizabeth, the Queen of the Belgians. She omits that from her book, and we only discovered that it happened by some letters that were found in the Royal Palace in Brussels.
But
So there's just a lot left out.
did she have a propaganda mission to prepare the U.S. to enter the war?
I think it was probably part of that, yes.
Okay.
She was very much against President Wilson because he kept us neutral.
Okay.
She really wanted the U.S. to be into the war right from the start. And so, yes, you could say there was a propaganda mission to that, to those articles.
Good.
In fact, when the book was reviewed, it was one of the reviewers of that period said, was, there's a lot of propaganda here.
No, thank you.
Sure.
Cynthia, you're next.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
for your talk. That was very enjoyable. I wondered, what did the people in the United States think about her as they read her writings, or perhaps she was covered in the press as doing this trip? And I also wondered, did she use these experiences in her novels then?
Two questions. First question is that her experiences were significant enough to the American public when they were published in Scribner's that Charles Scribner, asked to be able to pull the articles together into a book, which then had a good deal of sales, and it went through a number of issues. So yes, it made an impact that way, but not enough of an impact to bring us into the war. No. And the second thing is whether these experiences had an impact on her writing for novels. And I'm not really literary enough to make a comment. I don't know. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, see a hand up.
Yep, is Lardner?
Yes.
Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
I was just wondering, did the Germans know about her, or did they ever write about her or have any thoughts on her?
No, and that's why I wrote a novel. That's why I wrote this book, to look at it, what the Germans thought of her.
Okay, all right.
No, you could say they didn't have any knowledge of her. Although what's interesting about Edith, she spoke German as well as French, of course, but she was decidedly Francophile. Anyone else?
Anyone else with a question? Susan, go ahead, Susan, unmute yourself.
All right, what do I do now?
You'll have to unmute Susan.
Mute?
Susan,
Should I hit the mute?
try again, Susan. Thank you.
Okay. I just wondered where she got her money. Was she independently wealthy? And it must take some money to do all of that she did, whether she got sponsors or she used her own money.
Edith was a Jones, where the line came, keeping up with the Jones. Very rich American family. She had a house she made money from her writing. Also, there was family money. They had a house in Newport.
Okay.
Comes from, it's sort of American upper class family.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
so the money that she was raising primarily would be for her charities. That's where she does a lot of fundraising. But as far as these trips, I think they were all out of her own pocket.
Okay.
The car certainly would have been out of her own pocket, and that car at the time would have cost almost $10,000
Whoa.
at the time.
Well, it's very.
And you
it
can
is very-
multiply it by what, 5 or 10.
Yes.
So
Oh.
pretty well off. And she has a chauffeur, she's a staff.
Yes. Staff, yeah. No, interesting, very interesting.
Okay, Catherine is next, and then we have a question in the chat, which I'll read.
This is actually Catherine's husband, Tony. Speaking of money, Ed, how did she pay her hotel bills? When we travel these days, we use credit cards. Did she have to travel with a lot of money, or was she so rich and
Good.
well-known she could get a letter of credit?
It's a good question. I've never seen any references one way or another about that. I just assumed she carried cash, or Walter carried cash. I've never Never caught anything about that, but I would bet it was cash.
Well, it must have been a lot of cash, given the places that
Yeah.
she stayed at.
Yeah. Just, I mean, I agree with you, but there was never any, I've never seen any references or, notes or anything about that. But that's a good point. I never thought of it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, the question in the chat, Ed, is what first got you two interested in Wharton and Verdun?
Oh. Well, Libby and I, we were, let's see, what about 20 years ago? 2005? 2005, we got funds to produce a documentary for public television, and it was about the American Ambulance Field Service. And so that put us into the Verdun area. And we rented a gîte farmhouse and stayed there and, moved around. And that's how we wound up staying one night in the Coq Hardy. So it's actually researching the documentary and looking at who was in this area and what kind of things did they say, what did they see? Because we wanted to put it in terms of what it looked like then, not what it looks like now. And so caught onto her writing and realized that she'd been in Verdun before us. And that really where it started. Okay. Is that it?
Other questions?
Okay.
Mm-mm.
I just want to draw attention to the comment from Outsider Art, who I don't know who that is. That isn't it interesting that she was traveling in a German car?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right, a Mercedes. I always found that a little ironic myself, not a Renault, which also had similar cars, no, Mercedes. And the other interesting thing about it is that she was allowed to keep the Mercedes throughout the war, because in France, especially in Paris, most of the private cars were commandeered for the army, and she was allowed to keep hers. And I think this is primarily because of big charity efforts that she was involved in.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is that it?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to Ed and for Libby to come and do this. At this point in time, we would normally whip out a Amherst Women's Club mug and give them a mug. Both of them had said, please don't do that. They already have plenty mugs at home. So we will save their mug and keep it for our next speaker. So in 2 weeks, when we normally would be having a business meeting, well, we'll see who's coming up then. We're going to have a meeting about it tomorrow, so we'll let you know. I'll send an email to everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us today, and thanks very, very much to Ed and to Libby for coming today. So
Yes. Thank you very much.
see you all in 2
Thank you,
weeks.
everybody. Thank you
Bye-bye.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.